Good evening to all of you in Finland or wherever you are, and good morning from San Francisco. Welcome to our last class. We're going to discuss some new technologies, AI, ML, applications of blockchain, and the whole intent here is not to become experts in this. These are all evolving, emerging fields. But as business people, how to understand what these technologies can do, what they cannot do, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities. So that's the topic for the webinar today. Thanks to all of you who are here. I see Maria, Pankaj, Pierre, and Tommy. I hope a few more folks might join in. At this time, if I could request, if any of you are willing to turn on your cameras, that would be much appreciated. Thanks, Pankaj and Tommy and Pierre. Nice to see you. Um, Before we get into the topics for today, I just wanted to make sure that you all have seen the exam instructions on Moodle. Our first exam is on Thursday the 16th, same time 1800 to 2100. So just wanted to know, have you all been able to sign up for the exam? Either one, or we've given even the dates and times for the other two. So I just want to see how many of you will participate in exam one. Could you just give me a indication in the chat, or just say yes? The question is, are you signed up for exam one?
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
I will have
Okay,
the exam on Thursday.
very good, very good. Pankaj, did you have your hand raised?
No, just that I have also signed up on Monday.
Okay,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
good.
I was wondering which reaction to give. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, have you been able to read the exam instructions, and do you need any clarifications? Um, it's fairly straightforward and self explanatory. The most important thing is to have a good Zoom connection, right? It's going to be a proctored online exam, so I'll be there with you for exam one, and we want to make sure that everybody is signed in to Zoom and the camera has to be turned on. Up to now we've been leaving the camera voluntary during our Zoom webinars, but for that exam it is proctored, so I need to see everybody on camera during the duration of the exam. If you finish early, you can then submit your exam and then turn your camera off. You certainly don't have to stay for the whole time, but that's important. So make sure you're in a quiet place with a good internet connection.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, Rusa.
Yeah, I was wondering, did I understand correctly from your instructions that there will be 4 different questions and each of them can be only 1 page long? So there will be 4 pages to submit.
That is absolutely correct. There will be a
Okay.
case study that you have to read first, and then there'll be 4 short essay questions, right? So each question you can write 1 page.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. And during the exam, it is good to open a Microsoft Word document so that you can save things automatically, right? And then towards the end, when you're ready to submit, write, copy and paste into the Moodle form in Turnitin, and then submit. Because if you start writing in Moodle right away, and if something goes wrong with your computer, you could lose all your work. So that's why I'm advising you to first type it in Word, save it as you go along. And also I'm requesting everybody to convert the Word into a PDF before you submit it into Turnitin. Let's see in the chat. Okay. Any other issues that of an administrative nature that you wish to bring up? Okay. Good luck with the exam. So now we can get into the topic for today. I had assigned 3 readings. So first we'll take up the article on the difference between AI and machine learning. Then we'll get into Uber, the application of AI and machine learning to optimize the pickup experience. And then finally we'll get to applications of blockchain and Bitcoin. So that's the order in which we will go. So let's start out with some discussion on the first article. You were already exposed a little bit to AI and ML in the Verily Life Sciences case, right? So you have some basic knowledge about it, but let's get deeper into it. Let me ask first, what do you see as the difference between AI and ML? So how are the two related to each other, machine learning and artificial intelligence? I hope you have been able to do the readings, so you can answer my question on chat or use the microphone. What do you see as the important differences between AI and machine learning?
At least one key difference was that the machine learning is used by artificial intelligence and not the other way around.
Yes, thank you, Tommy. So we know clearly that machine learning is a subset of AI, right? You cannot have AI without machine learning. So first you've got to train the machine to recognize certain patterns, right? Just like let's start with the Verily example on digital retinopathy. So who can recap what was the machine learning experience, or what was the machine learning demonstrated in digital retinopathy, and physically how did that work? So let's try to recap where we left off with the Verily case. How does machine learning work for digital retinopathy within Verily?
So if I can make an attempt at it,
Yes.
we have the fundus photographs of the retina of the eye. These are standard photographs that are then studied by experts such as doctors or optometrists, and they are able to give a class for the level of severity of diabetic retinopathy. So I think the worst case scenario is where there was a particular class that was called, I don't remember the words, and then there is something that, okay, there is no possibility of retinopathy, there is some possibility, and then I think there were 3 or 4 levels to it. What we are able to do with the machine learning algorithm is we are able to take the image and not so basically you take thousands and hundreds of thousands of these images, and you have existing experts who have already given their conclusion on what the class of the image is. So we take that as the ground truth, that the machine learning model has to learn to arrive at.
Yes.
So we have the expected outcome, and then we have the model train itself to more and more accurately meet the expected outcome. So that's the iterations that you go through, and for example, what Google, the Verily Life Science was able to do was they took about 100,000 images. They had about 50 to 60 experts classify those images, and then they trained their algorithms, and then they took that trained algorithm to two different data sets. One data set from I think some France, and another data set from India itself. So these are the interesting point to understand here is the image data is of, for example, a different demographic of the Indian demographic, and they are able to use that to analyze eyes, for example, in France. They got very good sensitivity and specificity in the results. It's debatable what is very good, but at least in a statistical sense, it was like in case of diagnosis, you want to be 100% good. It is not sufficient that you're 97 or 98% good. So that's of course there, but still in purely mathematical terms, they are able to do a fairly good job of making the classification close to what the expert believe it to be.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pankaj, for that wonderful summary. So let's try to generalize a few rules about machine learning. One is that it definitely needs human input, right? One of the myths is that when lay people hear machine learning, they think that the machines can learn on their own without any, input from human beings, which is totally wrong. So, as in the Verily example, a lot of ophthalmologists initially have to look at hundreds of thousands of images first and categorize them into, yes, this is a digital retinopathy image, that is not a digital retinopathy image. And of course, you can have shades in between. But basically, the second rule is there has to be an outcome variable, right? The outcome variable is the disease present or absent. So it's the human being, the expert, who has to first classify the images on the basis of the outcome. And then you get into you get the actual data beyond what the experts have already looked at. You go to France or you go to India and you collect, many more hundreds and thousands of cases of these images, and you expose them to the algorithm. And by examining things like pixels and, the similarities between the images, they try to make a distinction and predict a new image. Is this got the DR disease or not? Right? And then you compare the predictions of the algorithm with the experts' judgments, and then you work out the statistical percentage on, sensitivity, specificity, which are basically reliability indicators. So that's what simply the machine learning, one of the most widespread applications is pattern recognition, right? And so that's something that we know what machine learning is. So let me pause here and see if anybody has any questions about understanding machine learning or any comments further about that aspect before we go to artificial intelligence. Okay, so now this article which was assigned in the reading, it tells us how artificial intelligence may be different than machine learning. So let me pose that question. Earlier, Tommy said that, machine learning is a subset of AI, and machine learning is a prerequisite to AI. So my question is then, what's the value added that AI brings in addition to machine learning. Anybody can take a shot at trying to, based on your reading, what do you think is the difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning? You can use the chat or you can use a microphone. Okay, so let me try to answer that question. So we know that machine learning, that there is an algorithm which has been trained, right? Now let's take a different example than digital retinopathy. Let's take a drone. You know, a drone can be programmed to fly from point A to point B, right? And it can have a machine learning algorithm which optimizes the route based on distance and, you know, time and so on, maybe energy consumption. So there is a drone that can use machine learning to optimize the route between point A and point B. Now, when it takes off, the drone might encounter some obstacles in its path. You know, like there's some other aircraft or some other, you know, hobbyist or another drone is in its way. Okay, so suddenly you get an unexpected obstacle. The drone faces that. But because it has sensors, it is able to avoid collision and it's able to, you know, digress from its programmed path and avoid collision. So that's like thinking more like a human being intelligently. Okay, so the bottom line is that artificial intelligence allows you to use real-time data or real-time inputs using sensors which can then update the machine learning algorithm. So for example, if the initial route did not encounter a very tall palm tree, you know, suddenly the palm tree comes up and the drone is able to avoid that, then it can send the data back to the algorithm saying that there is a palm tree at this and this location. So next time the algorithm will avoid that in its programmed path. So that's really the way the artificial intelligence works in addition to machine learning. Another example in healthcare would be like, you know, brain tumors. Brain tumors are also based on scans, right? Digital imaging, similar to digital retinopathy. But let's say there's a machine learning algorithm which has been trained to interpret whether a scan has a brain tumor or not, right? So we know the limitations of machine learning is it is as good as the data on which it has been trained, right? So if it doesn't have a diversity of different cases on which it has been trained, it could be limited in its prediction. So let's say that a neurologist, you know, is doing a video call with a patient and has the scan prediction from the machine learning algorithm, and the algorithm says that no, this person doesn't have a brain tumor. Okay, now the doctor, in talking with the patient, might hear about some symptoms, right? The patient might complain of excruciating headaches. That data was not available in the brain scan. So now the doctor getting this real-time data from the patient in terms of symptoms can actually say override the scan and also provide the data to the machine learning algorithm that if the doctor in the interaction with the patient finds that they have symptoms of excruciating headaches, then that is more likely to be a brain tumor. So that's an example where again AI uses real-time data to make predictions which are better than the machine learning algorithm. So again, let me pause here and see if everybody is clear on the difference between AI and ML, or if you need any further clarifications. Would anybody care to share any other example which helps to make the distinction between machine learning and AI different than the examples that we've used so far in drones and healthcare? Okay, I don't see any other comments or anybody willing to share any other examples. So now let's go on to the second article on Uber, applying machine learning to improve the customer pickup experience. So I'm always curious to ask this question. Last year, I don't think Uber was operating in Finland. Have they got to Helsinki now, or any other towns and cities? What's the status of Uber in Finland? If anybody can provide an update, I'd appreciate it.
I think it is there in Helsinki. I'm not sure on this, but I believe it's there in Helsinki. But there are a couple of there is another Russian app now which is quite famous in Helsinki, but I think there is also Uber now in Helsinki.
What is the name of the Russian brand?
It's Yango.
Yeah, I was about to say that most of my friends are using Yango instead of Uber.
Yeah,
Oh.
I was also just checking because I also live in Helsinki, so I was just thinking like, do we have Uber? We had it
Yeah.
before, like probably 5 years ago. I don't know.
It feels
But
very strange because
I
like
think it's still there, but I also use the Russian app. I don't know if it's
yeah,
any better than any other app, but yeah.
I
Could you
usually
please spell out in chat the name of the Russian brand Yango? How do you spell? Okay, Yango, Yango.
yeah, it's like mango without the M.
Okay. And does anybody know what it might mean? Is there a meaning, or it's just a coined word?
I have no idea. And I don't even know if it's the same name in every country or do they have different names for different markets. So
Okay.
I don't know any Russian.
And so some of you have had the experience. Can you describe what it was to take a ride in Yango compared to the regular taxi service that you have in Finland? How did Yango compare in terms of the customer experience?
Yeah, I'm gonna be completely honest. Me myself, I haven't really ordered this, but I have been traveling when my friends have been ordered the Yango, and every time when we're discussing that how much do you make from the driver, they always mention that they don't really get any money. It's the tipping. It's all the thing. You need to tip them if they're gonna make ends meet, so to speak. So that's one of the experiences that I always got with through these Yango services.
Yeah, thank you, Petri, for sharing that. So, this is important to understand the overall business model of ride sharing or any other sharing app, right? The big consumer value proposition is supposed to be lower cost than the traditional taxi service, but of course they are offering that at a lower cost by taking a lot of shortcuts, right? So the drivers are not unionized, so they don't get much pay or benefits, and the drivers use their own cars, so the services, whether it's Uber or Yango, they are not investing that much in their own fleet, right? So there are all these issues. There's the lower cost economic benefit to the consumer, but certainly there are other social costs. And in fact, Uber has been in the US for a long time. There have been a lot of court cases now brought on by, public interest groups. And at least in California, the courts have ruled that, the drivers of Uber are in a special category. They are not employees as a regular company, so they cannot have the full salary and benefits of a company employee, but they are not also full contractors. Contractors would not get any benefits. The courts in California have created another category of gig workers, which forces companies like Uber to give them things like health care and sick leave and other benefits. So again, some of the social costs, the governments and the courts are trying to get these ride sharing companies to step up and bear them, because otherwise it appears to be an exploitative business model. Anybody else has any experiences to share about Yango or about Uber if they've tried it?
One of the benefits that the drivers have had with these apps is it has somewhat lowered the barrier to entry
Yes.
to the taxi market, because in Helsinki, if there is some immigrant or somebody who is not confident with the language or not confident with the routes in the city, he's still able to start as a taxi driver, and the investment costs are lower, and there it's also the efficiency from the like the setting up a transaction with a customer and things like that are kind of facilitated by the app. So there is more possibilities, and the same car can be used by say 2 or 3 drivers in a day. So you have more capacity utilization from the car.
Yes, thank you, Pankaj. So, most of these sharing apps, they started after the Great Recession, financial crisis of 2008, right? When corporate had a lot of pain and suffering, companies let go a lot of full-time employees. So that's how this provided another source of employment to people who were laid off from their corporate jobs. And as Pankaj mentioned, it lowered the barrier to entry. In order to get a legitimate taxi permit, it costs a lot of money in big cities to be able to get a permit from the local government. But with these ride sharing apps, those who are unemployed could get in and do this to generate some income. And then even past the financial crisis, this has been a good way for people to have some flexibility in their work schedule and their income. So for many people, this might be a second job. They might be doing something else during the day, and then maybe they can drive for Uber in the evenings or on weekends and supplement their income. And a third point I would like to make about Uber is how it started. In San Francisco, in the year 2008, the average wait time for a regular taxi cab was about 30 minutes in peak time. Morning rush hour, evening rush hour, people could not get a taxi, a regular taxi. If you call, the wait time would be 30 minutes. And so there was a definite gap in the marketplace, an unmet need, which is why the founder of Uber, Travis Kalanick, he's the one who had this brilliant idea as an entrepreneur. What if I created a web-based platform for drivers to sign up and for riders to come there and order rides? And indeed, it was felt that it did serve a genuine need, which is why Uber has been able to get by through all of its legal fights. Uber always champions itself as a consumer oriented company. We are lowering the costs, we are providing a great service compared to the legitimate taxi service. So Uber is always positioned as a disruptor in all of its markets. So that was some background into just the history and the start of Uber as a business model. Again, wherever they go into a new city, they always face opposition from the taxi lobbies as well as from the governments. So they have a huge legal team, and that's what somebody mentioned. I think it may have been Rusa who said that 5 years ago they were in Helsinki and then they might have withdrawn. So they've been doing a lot of pilots and experiments to test the waters. But it is widely available in many of the big metro cities globally. And some of the benefits as a consumer that I've experienced myself is that the same app I can use here in San Francisco when I travel to India, to Mumbai or Delhi. I can use the same app over there. It's a pretty seamless global experience. So it does have benefits from the consumer point of view. Anybody else has any general comments or experiences about Uber or Yango before we delve more deeper into the questions on this specific case? Improving the customer pickup experience. Okay, if not, let's delve a little bit deeper. If you've read the case, what is the business problem that Uber is trying to solve in this particular case? So looking at this through the lens of the case analysis that you've done already for, Zoom and L'Oreal and Verily, what is the main business problem that Uber is faced with in this case? Any thoughts? Have you had a chance to read the case?
So briefly, I think it is about setting up the transaction or the meeting point between the customer, the person who needs the service, and the service provider. So they use the phrase pickup point, but I like to use the phrase setting up the transaction, because there are two people, one who needs the service, one who can provide the service, and uh, there are different levels of challenges in that, uh, which I hope somebody else will go into. But there is the technological layer to it, that okay, you're designing an app and the app needs to capture all the relevant data for the driver and for the consumer. And uh, like one common ground is the map. So what the coordination is happening over the map, and so in space and time you have to coordinate. Like if you think of it as a problem in physics, it's space and time, you are trying to meet two coordinates, and then there is the cultural, the business, and the economics of doing that.
Right. So, Pankaj, you said that it is about setting up the transaction. That's partially correct, but is it also not about execution? It's about both setup as well as
Yeah,
execution, right?
yeah. In fact, execution is ultimately,
Right.
yes.
So let me pose the second question, that why is it important for Uber to improve the customer pickup experience? Anybody? We've just you know inferred first that they want to set up and execute the transaction between the driver and the rider, which is another way of saying they want to improve the customer pickup experience, the totality of it. And my question to you is, why is Uber so concerned about this? Anybody else apart from Pankaj? Pankaj has already made his contributions. I would like somebody else to tell me, why is it important for Uber to improve the customer pickup experience? It's a fairly simple, straightforward question.
I would say that it's because it's a part of Uber's vision to have the effortless pickup transaction offering. And then that way it's also a part of their competitive edge, because that is what they're driving through into the market.
Okay, very good. So it's definitely their vision, but they also want to do it for more practical business reasons, right? If you improve the customer experience, there'll be more completed rides, there'll be more customer satisfaction, more retention, more revenue and profits. So it's not doing it only because of the vision. Vision certainly is what motivated it to come into the market and launch, but in order to sustain itself, right? And there are competitors, right? In the US, the big competitor is Lyft, Lyft. In India, there is Ola, and there's so many others in Singapore and Vietnam. I've seen Grab, GRAB. So Uber is present in many different countries, but it always has a second competitor. So like Maria mentioned, it has to do with outcomes in the marketplace, competitive edge, being able to retain more customers, repeat business, right? So it's all very good, sound business reasons. It's not just doing this just because some manager or some engineer wants to do it. Okay? All right, now let's get deeper into it. what kinds of analysis does Uber need to do to address this problem of improving the customer pickup experience? What kinds of business analysis? So think about it as a process, right? Setting up the transaction, executing the transaction, there are so many steps to it. So what kinds of analysis does Uber need to do?
One would be customer segmentation in order to find the buyer personas and then differentiate the services more towards their needs.
Okay, so very good. There is a big complication because there's 5 different types of customers, right? There's some premium customers who want very luxurious white glove service. There are commuters, right? There are people who want to travel to airports and railway stations. So that means you have at least 5 different service processes that you need to analyze. But then again, within any one segment, what does it need to analyze? So very simply, the first thing is, what are the pain points for riders and also for drivers, right? So when you're doing the analysis and if your objective is to improve the experience, right, you have to look at the problems or pain points, right? And it's not only the pain point, although you want to improve the customer experience, you cannot ignore the pain points of the drivers, because if the drivers are late or cannot get to the right spot, then it's going to affect the customers. So again, you see the level of complexity. For each of the segments or personas, you have to analyze the problems that the riders are facing and also what the drivers are facing, right? Then you need to predict the best location for the driver to pick up the rider. So that's where your machine learning comes in. You're going to make a prediction, right? Where should they both come? That's called the anchor point. And then finally, also very closely related to machine learning, you have to develop a metric or an outcome, right? Otherwise, the algorithm is not going to work. So the 3 kinds of analysis that you have to do for each customer segment: analyze the pain points of the riders and the drivers. Then you need to develop a model or an algorithm which will predict the best location, right? And then you have to develop a metric or an outcome for measuring the quality of the pickup experience. So again, see the complexity of it. You have 5 different segments. You have to analyze the problems of the driver and the rider. So that's 5 times 2, right? And then there's also, within that, there is a customer journey that each customer has to go through. What did you pick up about the customer journey? What kind of steps are involved in the customer journey? That was an important part of the case. Let's see if anybody can bring that to our attention. What are the steps in the customer journey? So I would like to call your attention to Exhibit 3 of the case. Exhibit 3 is on page 16, and here are the 6 steps in the customer journey. Let me share it if people don't have it with them. So first, the system has to deduce where the rider is, determine the best rendezvous location or the anchor location. The location has to be confirmed by the rider. Yes, this is where I am, passed on to the driver. Driver's route is optimized to reach that location. And then at the point where the car stops, enable the rider to track the car and take action appropriately, and make sure the rider and driver can actually find each other. So again, just to summarize the complexity of it, Maria mentioned 5 customer segments. The pain points are different for drivers and for riders. That's 5 times 2. And then there are pain points at each of these 6 steps in Exhibit 3, the customer journey. So that's 5 times 2 times 6, about 60 different analyses that may have to be done. So, this is where it becomes complicated for a human being to scale this. And that's the first thing that I want you all to appreciate, is that if you want to apply machine learning, you do need to have a lot of complexity in both the scope of the problem and the scale, which are beyond human abilities. If it was a small enough problem, a few people could get into a room and brainstorm on a whiteboard and figure out, what's going wrong and what the solution is. But when you have 60 different, analysis points, and you have to collect data about this, and you have to do that in scale from, literally hundreds of thousands of riders and thousands of drivers, then you can appreciate where machine learning can be applicable. So any comments and or reactions about, when is machine learning applicable? So a general takeaway is machine learning is applicable when there's a lot of scope of complexity, when there's a huge scale, and it is beyond human capabilities to do this. So that's where it is. You can't apply machine learning as a big hammer to every kind of problem, because it is so expensive to implement. It is expensive to collect data that we've seen in the Verily case, and it requires a lot of effort in data curation and all of the computing power that requires infrastructure and investment. But certainly for Uber, this is a good problem to which you can apply machine learning.
I think one more value of machine learning for this particular business model is you are continuously gathering more and more data. And so the best way to continuously learn from whatever experience that you are generating every day, this machine learning model lends itself naturally to such a situation where you have a continuous stream of data that you need to find patterns and improve your operations and efficiency from. in contrast with some other business model, which is like a production company. So the production in the factory to the used by the customer, there is a long delay, but here things are happening in real time, and so there is a natural efficiency. And earlier we were discussing why the pickup is important, like why it is important to solve this problem. And a general comment, like you mentioned, um, why it is important for their business, because this business specifically depends on network effects to grow. And if there are more customers, there will be more drivers, and if there are more drivers, there will be more customers. And in that case, how do you incentivize or seed that process? And the pickup point is that first contact that you have. And so if that is seamless, you are doing strategically, you are approaching it right in terms of seeding the process.
Yes, thank you, Pankaj. I think the takeaway I got from your comment is that it is not, machine learning is not for solving a one-time problem, but it is for solving and improving continuously a problem that exists in real time. So that's a really useful insight. Okay, so you've got to have complexity in scope, you've got to have the problem is of a large scale, and it must be a continuous problem, not just a one time problem. I think that's really important. So thanks for sharing that insight. Anybody else would like to make any comments about the applicability of machine learning? Do you see that it is not a hammer to drive every nail, but it requires certain criteria of projects in order to benefit from the automation and the machine learning and the continuous improvement? So that's important. Now let's get a little bit deeper into the customer journey. We talked about analyzing the pain points, right? So try to think of yourself as the rider and anticipate what some of the pain points might be. If you've had some experiences or difficulty, that would help, but otherwise just think empathetically, think with empathy. What are the possible things that could go wrong in the customer journey that I showed you from exhibit 3 in a practical way? There are some good examples in the case. I want people to say what those are.
For example, the rider's GPS can be bad, like the internet connection is bad, and then it can be like at, for example, 50 meters off or something like that, and then the driver goes to the wrong place.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Tommy. So we know that GPS accuracy is only up to 50 meters, and that's the the driver may be 50 meters away, and the rider cannot see that. So again, that's an important thing. It will cause a delay, right? Another example would be, according to the map, you're at the right place, the driver is at the right place technically on the street, but it's a very busy street or a busy road with a barrier in between, and the rider is on the other side. So it's not easy for the rider to cross over, and even the driver has to go up ahead and make a U-turn. So that's another practical example where, okay, on the map it's showing that you're right next to the driver and the rider are in close proximity, but there's a huge road dividing them and it's not easy to cross. That's another practical problem. And then there could be, inherent limitations of maps, right? I remember in the early days of Uber, in India, it was so difficult, to explain where you are because the maps were not as good quality as they are now. And again, in some of the, densely populated cities and towns, the coordinates are so difficult. Invariably, I used to have to call the driver on the phone and tell them, okay, you have to make this left and that right, and then you'll pass this temple, and then you'll come across this two-storied pink house, and that's where I'm going to be. So, the early days of Uber, and in certain countries or cities where the maps were not as sophisticated, again, it caused a lot more intervention was necessary on the phone rather than just doing things on the platform. And that did require more effort and didn't produce as good a seamless experience. Okay, now I want to get to the actual machine learning algorithm. We said earlier that there needs to be an outcome that measures the quality of the pickup experience. So, anybody has any thoughts about what this outcome variable might be? Any indicators? How do we try to get at the outcome variable for the algorithm? What's from a business point of view or a marketing point of view, what's the most obvious variable that can measure the quality of the pickup experience? How about customer satisfaction? Do you think that customer satisfaction is something that we might consider, that Uber might consider to measure the quality of the pickup experience?
So yeah, customer satisfaction certainly. Like I think the one obvious thing is that the transaction happened. So if a driver called a taxi and then he completed the ride, so one obvious thing would be the number of dropped rides versus completed rides, and another was the communication. So if no communication was needed after calling for the taxi, so that is an indicator that the ride was seamless. Like, but if there was some phone call needed to be made or so then there was some coordination effort required by the driver or the and also, like in the case study, they mentioned that in the US, the customers don't prefer to talk to the taxi driver. In India, that's the opposite. They actually, even if everything is set up by this, they still want to confirm with the driver because there are perhaps more variables involved and more uncertainty. So there is a general preference by the customer to have a call with the driver. And perhaps even the drivers prefer that because even from the customer sides, there can be uncertainties. So I think those two things, one is a natural, and then I think by satisfaction, you mean the rating that the customer gives to is that what you meant?
Yes, but I would clarify that it is not customer satisfaction with the entire ride, but for this specific problem, it should be customer satisfaction with the pickup.
Yeah.
In other words, as soon as they get into the car, there has to be some kind of survey taken. Do you see? Otherwise, it could, you could bring in other things like, is the car clean or not? Is the driver chatty or not? That's not important for the pickup experience. So we need to, this is the important part about the business analysis, is that the people who are in the industry and familiar with the actual process, right, they have to think of what are the relevant outcome variables as well as what are the independent variables that might impact that outcome variable. Okay. And the second point you made is, of course, there are differences between countries like, in the US versus India. However, when we are trying to construct the machine learning algorithm, at least to begin with, we want it to be as generalizable as possible in order to get the benefits of the scale, right? In other words, we are not making this machine learning algorithm separately for India and separately for US, but we want to choose the variables that are common in explaining the outcomes in both countries. Later on, as you get more data, you might update the algorithm. But since we are, in this case, we are at the early stage of trying to build the algorithm, we should consider the most important generalizable variables. Would you agree? So now I'm going to share my notes and just take you through the algorithm in a very simple way, and please feel free to ask questions or give your own comments about this. So I hope you can see the point number 4 here. The quantitative formula for the quality of the pickup experience must be universal and scalable. One of the variables they've cited in the case, which is like a measure of customer satisfaction, but it's very specific to pickup. They call it pickup happiness. And again, I'm just speculating that here are 3 independent variables that might be related to the happiness. The number of steps to the rendezvous, that is, wherever the rider was initially when they ordered the ride to actually reaching the pickup point, that's you want to minimize that, right? Because the more the number of steps, the less the happiness. The number of ETA changes. ETA is estimated time of arrival. So this refers to the messages that need to be exchanged between the driver and the rider, or between Uber and the rider before the pickup, between the order and the pickup. So for example, if the system has to tell them that you need to walk to another place, that's one change. Or initially, if the estimate for pickup time was 3 minutes, and then later there's an update that it's going to be now 7 minutes, then that's a change. So you want minimum number of changes. And then the time spent in search in terms of navigation and getting to the order from when you were actually in the app, that time spent should also be minimized. So do you see that there are 3 independent variables, and that will impact pickup happiness. Now look at this in terms of a statistical technique. You guys may be somewhat familiar with OLS regression, which is a very deterministic statistical technique. What happens in regression is that if you have historical data on the independent variables as well as the dependent variables, then you could actually get a deterministic formula which is in the next paragraph, pickup happiness is equal to A times number of steps plus B times number of ETA changes plus C times the time spent and plus some intercept D. So the statistical technique of regression will actually find you numerical estimates of A, B, C and D. Okay. So now and the difference is in machine learning, you do not use regression. You use something called neural networks. So what does that mean is that, your historical data is still required, but you start with some initial iteration values for A, B, C and D. You plug them in and you see how close you are to the outcome in the data. And if there are deviations, then you do another iteration on the parameters A, B, C and D. So it's a trial and error numerical process. And ultimately, the values of A, B, C and D that converge are those in which the data on the independent variables fits very well the outcome variable. Okay. So now, if you can predict using this equation that a customer is unhappy, say that it should be below a certain threshold, sorry. So, maybe your pickup happiness is like a 5-point scale, right? 3 is the neutral point. So, if you have now a new rider who's ordering something from Uber, and you know how many steps they've taken, how many ETA changes they've done, and how much time has been spent, then you can get a prediction on the pickup happiness. If that is below a certain threshold, like if it's below 3, then you have to intervene. So you could do some intervention, like have the driver make a call, or you could, if you know that person is unhappy, you could compensate the rider with a discount for the inconvenience. So that's the power of the machine learning algorithm, is that for a new rider, you can make predictions about their happiness or unhappiness. And if you predict that that's going to be an unhappy pickup, then you can do some manual intervention to try to get them to be happy again before you, take your customer satisfaction at the end of the ride. So this is how the machine learning algorithm really works. This is why you need a lot of historical data with a lot of different use cases, different countries, right? And again, the option is open that if this does not predict well in certain countries, then maybe you can add variables and continuously improve the algorithm going forward. Let me pause here and see if you have any questions or comments or reactions to how the machine learning algorithm works. So to wrap up the Uber pickup experience case, this is what machine learning is about. There really is no scope for AI in this particular application. This is purely a machine learning application. It works and it's still in existence, and it's definitely able to give Uber some kind of competitive advantage. Remember that in the competition, at least in the US, I'm familiar with, Uber versus Lyft, which is the second competitor. It's the intellectual property and the know-how that's going to give, riders a better experience compared to the other. So the more resources Uber has compared to Lyft to do this kind of deep analysis and invest in these kind of machine learning algorithms, to the extent that Lyft is not able to do some of that, that's going to give Uber an edge in the marketplace. Okay. Thank you, Pankaj. Pankaj wrote in the chat that the correction I made is wrong. So let me go back and correct that. So I had it correct initially because it's a minimization problem, right? So it is above. So again, let's understand this well. The problem was pickup happiness is a minimization of all these things. So the lower the better, right? So if somebody is unhappy, they will be high in pickup happy in this particular metric, right? So thank you, Pankaj. That was a good catch. I had it right. I got confused, but now I'm happy to make the change. So anybody has any closing comments or thoughts about the Uber case that we just went over? So earlier you had a little bit of exposure in Verily about how machine learning is used for digital retinopathy. I hope this gives you another very deep dive into how Uber is using it for a totally different application. And what this case shows us is that machine learning requires certain characteristics to work, like the scope of complexity, the scale, the continuous improvement part of the problem, right? And I hope I've shown you some of the mechanics of how this is done differently than image pattern recognition, which was the earlier Verily application. Okay, if we are done with that, then we will go now next to the article on blockchain and Bitcoin. So I thought this was a very good article from the New York Times. It's not a technical journal, but the New York Times has a lot of technology writers who write quite well for a layperson audience. And so this gives you a lot about the history of Bitcoin, blockchain, what's the difference between the two, and so on. So it's become so much of a buzzword. Everybody, every day, the media has so many articles about these topics. But again, my purpose here is to discuss where blockchain is applicable, where the benefits could be realized, right? So I want to go to that discussion next. So first question for all of you is, what is the difference between blockchain and Bitcoin? Any thoughts? What is Bitcoin and what is blockchain? What's the interrelationship between the two? Yeah, thank you, Pankaj, for your chat. Bitcoin is a product for sure. It's an asset. It's a digital asset. It's like a stock. People trade it, right? So it is a product. Blockchain is the concept. I would say also blockchain is the technology on which Bitcoin is based, right? It's the underlying know-how the whole process. So you can't have Bitcoin without having blockchain, but there are many other applications of blockchain apart from Bitcoin. That's important. So, Bitcoin has I'm less interested in discussing Bitcoin because it is just one application. I'm much more interested today in discussing blockchain. But just to, give you a chance, are there any things you would like to bring up with regard to Bitcoin first? Maybe some of you have had experiences with Bitcoin, or you've read about it, and what are some of the myths, and what are some of the realities? What would you like to know? Anything about Bitcoin? Has anybody tried investing in Bitcoin? So if we do a quick analysis of Bitcoin, what are the benefits and what are some of the downfalls? Any thoughts?
I think one of the downfalls or some things that are criticized by public are the ethical aspects of it, and if it's sustainable or not.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Rusa. So we know that this whole blockchain technology, and it's not limited to Bitcoin, it is very high on electricity power consumption. Okay, so I think that's the point, Rusa, you're making, right? That is it sustainable? Because if we are using up, such large amounts of electrical power, and a lot of it is from fossil fuels, then it's not going to be sustainable, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's
Thank you.
one of the points that I was also thinking.
Thank you. So this is absolutely correct. And this is a limitation of all of blockchain, that, in order for it to work, you have to solve some very huge computational problems. And they require large amounts of processing power, they require large amounts of storage, and then there are these companies which have just banks and warehouses of servers which consume tremendous amounts of electricity. So there is a certain skepticism about, how long can it sustain. So there is pressure on the Bitcoin industry to become more, to reduce their carbon footprint, to use more non-fossil fuels and, things of that nature. But that's going to be a pretty hard problem to solve in the near term. Okay, thank you, Rusa. What else? We're doing an analysis of Bitcoin. What are the benefits and what are the pitfalls? We've already covered the sustainability aspect of Bitcoin and blockchain, which is power consumption. But what are some other things that we can benefit from discussing?
Well, one downside of Bitcoin is that it's not regulated everywhere.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it cannot everywhere be perceived the same as the local currency, for instance. And then because of that, there are also some more questionable things happening with Bitcoin as well.
Excellent. So we know that this is disruptive to government currencies, potentially disruptive. I can't say it's already disrupted. So very many governments see this as a threat to their control of currency, right? So the governments, at least in the US and the European Union, they are very suspicious about this. And the second point Maria made is absolutely correct, that it encourages criminal activity, no question about it, because it's very difficult to detect the identity of the people engaged in these transactions. Bitcoin is used by drug dealers, by illegal arms dealers, trafficking in all kinds of banned products and services. So it is a kind of threat to the order of civilized society in some sense, right? And so many governments are very cautious of it. Some have even banned outright Bitcoin. But on the positive side, there's other things as well. So we've documented a couple of the important negatives, but why has it flourished so much? What's the benefit of Bitcoin? Anybody?
There's a possibility to get high rewards for investments.
Okay, so it's the investor return on investment, right? There's some amount of investor greed, right? This is a new technology. It's supposed to be the currency of the future if it's disruptive, right? So people want to invest, and then the value, I think, over the years has broadly trended upwards. Of course, it's very volatile from day to day, but in general, those who invested early seem to have made a lot of money on Bitcoin. So that's one of the benefits to individuals and consumers. And any other benefits?
I think many of the benefits are also like its downfalls. So maybe the fact that it's like independent from central banks and authorities is a good thing, but it can also be a downfall for it.
Okay. Yeah, so this is what, the the founders of this technology, the blockchain, they wanted to do something where government doesn't have control and authority over. Not for the criminal part, but they just think that, transactions between individuals are a private matter and nobody should, have oversight or interfere with that. In other words, the people who started blockchain and Bitcoin, they believe that trust has to be built. We know from an economic standpoint, trust is the building block of any economic transaction. But the people, the founders of blockchain and Bitcoin, they do not trust the government. Instead, they trust the community. Okay? So this is the extreme benefit, is that, you trust your peers, you trust each other more than the government. So that is a very fundamentally different way of thinking. It's more, private enterprise. Like when businesses sign contracts with each other, it's not that every transaction there is some oversight or anything like that, right? When individuals buy and sell houses, yeah, okay, there's some laws and the sellers and the buyers have to conform to it, right? So the first level of trust is between individuals and between businesses, and then there's the government, which kind of has the oversight, and in many democracies we trust the government. But we also know that governments make mistakes all the time, right? Think of how many wars have been engaged with government legitimacy, right? So many things that the government is powerless to counter in so many different countries, right? Corruption, oh my goodness, right? We know how corruption can impact businesses, especially when some governments are corrupt and they want to take things like bribes and payoffs, right? Then this kind of a technology might help to reduce that kind of corruption, because you're not relying on any government authority to safeguard the transaction, but you're relying on the community to validate the identities of the seller and the buyer, and that becomes the basis of the transaction. So that's a really important, good analysis of the pros and cons of Bitcoin. And now let's get a little bit more into blockchain. How does blockchain use the community to ensure trust? That is my next question to you all. And I think this article does a great job of explaining how this works. So let's do a deep dive into that and see whether we understand the building blocks of blockchain.
So when we are saying that we use the community to build trust, I had a question that when you use the word community, how are you suggesting it? Because for example, with blockchain and the products derived from it, such as the currency Bitcoin, they have a particular let's just use short form language and let's call it algorithmic way to establish that trust. So basically, if for example, if I have a transaction with Tommy and we don't know each other, but he doesn't have a reason to trust me, I don't have a reason to trust him, but the technological aspects of it ensure that I am who I say I am, and Tommy is who Tommy says I am, or we don't even know each other. And then so that was, I think, one question I had for you, because you mentioned that you trust the community, and what was your suggestion there?
Okay, very good. So let's look at a micro level transaction. Suppose you want to transfer 10 euros. Actually, I shouldn't call it euros, but whatever currency, digital currency, it might be Bitcoin, it may be Ether.
Yeah.
Suppose you want to transfer 10 units of digital currency to Tommy, right? Now, you have to go online and you have to use a particular system. Like this article talks about Ethereum, right? Ethereum is not a company, but it is some organization. There is some way of you registering on that and Tommy registering on that. Unless you have unless both of you are present, you could not do that. So for example, I've never done a transaction in blockchain, so I don't have a ID, right? So I haven't participated in this. But my understanding is that the entry point is that you have to register on the Ethereum system, and the article says that it starts with a seed phrase, right? So there is some string of characters in English, some words that individually make sense, but as a collection they don't make sense. So you have a seed phrase and Tommy has a seed phrase when you register, right? Then there is a program called MetaMask which does some transformations. So it takes the seed phrase and it gives you some string of unintelligible characters, letters and numbers, and it gives Tommy another set of, right? That's called the private key. So the way MetaMask works is that with the same seed phrase you can have only one private key, and it's easy to use MetaMask in that direction to convert the seed phrase into the private key but it's not easy for anybody else to figure out the way the algorithm works to go back from the private key back to the seed phrase. Right? So that's the power of the algorithm, and those algorithms have been set by the people who made MetaMask. Right? So it's not like nobody can figure it out, but generally lay people cannot figure it out. And then there is some other transformation from the private key into the public key, which can then be shared with each other. So then you will go into a ledger in Ethereum and you will say public key of Pankaj transfers 10 units of currency to public key of Tommy. Right? So you have posted that transaction. Now it is up to the rest of the community to validate it. And this is the important aspect of the understanding is it requires a lot of computational power and math ability for anybody who is on the community to invest in the time and effort to go back from the public key to the private key. They cannot go back to the seed phrase, but they can go back from the public key to the private key and say, yes, this is Pankaj's identity and that is Tommy's identity. And the incentive to do that is that you're granted digital currency for solving that computational problem and validating the transaction as a community member. So nobody knows who is the community member that's validated it except by their public key. And nobody knows, what's the identity of Pankaj or Tommy apart from their public keys. But then that community person who first solves the problem and earns the Bitcoin, then the algorithm updates the ledger on all the computers that have the ledger on it. That's part of the algorithm as well. So everybody's ledger is updated that the public key of Pankaj gives the public key of Tommy 10 units of currency. So this is how it is a self-perpetuating system of trust. There are incentives for community members to solve this problem. And that's what some of these mining companies do, in China and elsewhere. All they're trying to do is earn this digital Bitcoin by being the first to solve this validation problem. So that was a long answer, but let me pause and see here if that makes any sense or not.
Yeah, at least now I understood from what point you were suggesting the community trust. So yeah, because now there are, for example, 10, 12 different communities, and then you basically go ahead and create an identity within one community. And in that sense, you are kind of trusting the people. And as you mentioned, there is no private company or there is no this. So essentially you are while the algorithm takes care of it, there's a community that nurtures or kind of that kind of agrees to use that mechanism among themselves. Yeah.
And the beauty of this technology or the genius of the founders was this way of creating the economic incentive that everybody will be interested to validate. And it has another property. The people who solved these problems initially in history got larger incentives. And that amount of the incentive is decreasing over time simply because it was important to create the critical mass initially for the momentum to take over and create that kind of shortage so that the digital currency of Bitcoin has value. If there was not a shortage, then that would not maintain its value. So again, to be honest, I don't know anything about how the algorithm really works, but I do understand the principle or the concept of, how you create these kind of algorithms to have a self-perpetuating system. And this is why this is good to do things like cross-border transactions. We already have eBay, right? Now think about it. eBay has sellers and buyers across different countries, and certainly they are selling and buying. But there is always this issue that if the goods have to be shipped, you have to do paperwork for customs, right? And there is scrutiny physically of the goods, right, when it gets there. So there are these kinds of frictions in the system of global trade. And just to, compare that with, if you had a system of having an eBay on a blockchain system, right? I think the physical customs inspections you couldn't do much about, because if the physical goods have to be shipped, that kind of process will still be there. But if you're selling and buying digital goods, right? Software, music, art, right? If you're selling anything digital, then think of how much seamless the trade will be on a blockchain type of platform compared to if the government is always having some protocol that, okay, you're allowed to do this or you're not allowed to do that. So that's the real promise of blockchain. Let's open it up to any comments or questions by anybody else. So the other part of the article that I particularly enjoyed was how they've analyzed the evolution of the internet. In the first stage, right, in 1994 and those early years, most of the infrastructure, there were global standards to which all parties agreed, right? The standard of TCP/IP to, transmit packets of electronic data, right? The protocol of HTML, which was how the web pages could be displayed. That is what is called the Internet 1 or the base level infrastructure. All of that was free, all of that was open, and we all benefited from it, right? Then what happened was there was a big mistake. And again, as a person who is very interested in history, I'm particularly impressed by this article where it said that the original people who thought of the internet, people like Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who brought out the protocol of TCP/IP and the other one HTML and so on, they did not think of establishing identity as a critical part of the level 1 infrastructure. So what happened was that you had private companies that got into this business and they exploited network effects. And Facebook is the prime example of that. It has close to 2 billion users. And how did it start? It started on the Harvard University campus that it only admitted people with a .edu address, because that's what Mark Zuckerberg wanted. He wanted to get dates with single women, right? So he wanted that it should be safe. There were other social networks before that. For example, what was that big one? There was Friendster, and then there were some others.
Orkut.
Yes, Orkut, and the big one, the big one. I'm blanking on the brand name right
We're
now.
talking about MySpace.
Yes, thank you. MySpace. MySpace was in existence long before Facebook, but it had no way of verifying identities, and it collapsed. You know, there was too much spam on that. So Facebook started out with this system of verifying first people have a .edu address and then insisting that people use their real names, and later on they even started asking people for ID to verify those identities. So now you have a private company which authenticates identities and makes it safe for us to post content, although there are severe limitations to that, we know. But the whole thing about validation of identities has gone closed and proprietary. Companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, these have now become dominant. And to some extent, it's the vision of the people who are now, doing things like blockchain, that they want the power to be distributed again instead of being concentrated in these 4 or 5 companies worldwide, which people don't trust now, right? By and large, Facebook's trust has been eroded. So now can we try to get the trust back in the community by getting into blockchain? So that's another important reason. But it's interesting how, in terms of technology evolution, it was an oversight for the founders of the first level of infrastructure not to include identity as a part of the free and open infrastructure. So let me pause here and see if you have any observations about any of this.
So one of the things that they talk about in the case study is I can read that sentence. I have marked it.
Yes.
Um, Basically, it talks about that for such communities to grow, to have this decentralized identity, you need some initial activity similar to the case of, say, Uber or any of these things where you have people investing in that community, so that then it can have more decentralized storage spaces, it can have more decentralized facilities which then can be used. And so, like you mentioned, one of the biggest innovations there was incentivizing people to offer services to the community in the form of spare storage space, in the form of building applications on top of it, in the form of doing transactions. So in that sense, it's a marketing problem. Like, how do you get the initial people to join the community? And there is some high level of learning required by all involved, whether you are just a passive user or some active service provider. And I think that is the barrier that needs to be lowered, or kind of some ramp created for people to start working there.
Yeah, Pankaj, I think you are very insightful in your comment. I think that initially this whole movement got started by somebody called Satoshi Nakayama or somebody like that. Nobody knows the true identity, and it was all among the highly technical nerd geek community in computer science, right? And that's why even when reading this New York Times articles, it's somewhat confusing. What do these strings mean, and all these alphabets and characters and so on? So you're absolutely right. at this level, this is a high-tech product or service, right? It has all the types of market uncertainty, technology uncertainty, and competitive volatility, which we've studied at the beginning of the course. And that always presents a challenge to marketeers. So what we need to do is we need to lower those uncertainties. And it's happening over time, right? So for example, the more these things are discussed in the media, the more they are introduced in courses. I have to admit that this topic, you are only the second class in LUT to have this as a formal part of this course. 3 years ago, I was not having any topic like this. And so, this knowledge has to diffuse, and the technology has to become easier to use. Clearly, there are still those uncertainties. You talked about sharing of computing resources. How many of us will feel comfortable giving up our CPU and storage to strangers whom we've never met, right? Even though I like the concept, I'm still so untrusting because of all the history of hacks and viruses that we have been exposed to. So that is the consumer and the market FUD, right? The fear, uncertainty and doubt. But there are efforts of individuals. There's this person called Juan Bennett in Palo Alto. They talked about him, how he's trying to introduce more and more useful applications and start a movement. It's really a grassroots movement, but the important thing is that it is grassroots rather than being controlled by corporations. All these companies together, the Facebooks and Apples and the Googles and Amazons, their label is winner take all capitalism, right? The first person to establish the network effects, they get all the profits and the rest don't get anything. As opposed to these kind of movements, the real benefit is that everybody can generate digital currency and benefit from it and make some money. So to some extent it's the real promise or value proposition is the democratization of capitalism to some extent, but it's still a work in progress and it will take some more years to become commonplace. Anybody else would like to make any closing thoughts or comments about blockchain or Bitcoin? So in the US now, this fall, there is a new exchange called Coinbase, which is a legitimate exchange which is approved by the government, and it's kind of an aggregator of all the different currencies. It's not only about Bitcoin, but you can invest in Ether or other forms of digital currency. It is regulated overall by the government, right? Because it is a registered company, but that's again a step towards crossing the chasm and making things a little more easy for mainstream customers to invest in digital currency. There was a country recently that has legitimized Bitcoin, right? It's in South America. Is it blanking now whether it's Ecuador or Venezuela? Does anybody remember? There was some country, El Salvador, sorry, yes, El Salvador. The government of El Salvador has legitimized the Bitcoin as a currency. So all companies and businesses can use it. So this is an important first step. If a government has accepted this as legal tender, that is a major step forward, right? So we are seeing these kind of steps happen. Any other thoughts or closing comments? So again, I just in closing, we started out the day with about 9 people participating, and then first we did the AI and ML, and then some 4 people dropped out. You guys are the 4 remaining, so I want to acknowledge you, Maria, Pankaj, Rusa, Tommy. You were really interested in this topic. I hope you got something out of it. It's all these are optional. We don't really have any exam or test questions on this, but I just wanted to get some feedback whether you thought it was worth it for you to spend the 2 hours this evening. I know it's a very busy time of year with all the exams and projects going on, but I do want to thank you for staying with me till the end, and I hope that this is something that was of benefit to you. I'd just like to hear your reactions.
Yeah, at least for me, the Bitcoin case was probably the most interesting and timely.
Okay, thank you.
I would also agree with Rosa that I also found the Bitcoin article the most interesting, and also this conversation, and especially the large emphasis on blockchains, because I think I knew more about Bitcoin than I did about blockchains before.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, similarly for me, actually, I was actually hoping that we would start the discussion with the blockchain paper rather than the other two. But just because I found there was the article, as you mentioned, is quite very well written, and it covers historical trends, patterns, what we can expect, what can go wrong, what has gone right, and so it's a very balanced and a very insightful article to read. Particularly the concept of identity and why it got privatized, and why it would be beneficial to not have it as a private, because I've been familiar with the concept for a time now, and I know something, but it's been on the periphery, not really going into it. For me, the concept, there was some startups which are trying to do it for commodities, like a blockchain supply chain and things like that. So there was some awareness about those, but it all seemed esoteric even then. But now it starts to have some more appeal. So thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I had to diverge from others because I like the machine learning case and the Uber case, because I'm pretty interested about possibilities of machine learning and the big data, and also the artificial intelligence, like how they could be used in the future in businesses. And I think like it's gonna get more and more common in the software business. So I like that one.
Okay, very good. Thank you all for your comments, for your participation, not only in this session, but throughout the semester. This particular session is being recorded, and I will post it in Moodle. If you think it would benefit others, please help spread the word of mouth. Even during the break, if people want to later on review this will be on Moodle. So I do, it is, again, to be frank, this is new learning for me as well. I know more about AI and machine learning than blockchain, which is why I ordered them in that manner. But, at this master's level, that's what I enjoy most about these courses, is that we get to learn from each other and then make progress that way. So with that, I'll close out this session. Good luck with the rest of all your exams and projects in this semester and in the future in the master's program at LUT. And I hope to see you all again during the exam one or at some other time in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.